Right, well, let's see if this is actually working. Hopefully it is. Good evening and welcome to what may be the first of what is hopefully many feedback streams that we're going to be doing as part of the Squidmar Open, or the Squid Server Open, I should say. If they don't go very well, this will be the one and only, and as we're already having technical issues, well, maybe it's a sign. If we have anybody watching, please comment something within chat, just mostly for my own sense of not just talking to myself. I do that enough anyway. And for pure transparency, you were, and currently still are, listening to the band Miracle of Sound playing his Warhammer 40k song. In fact, seemed fairly appropriate. And we currently have, I believe, just 2 people who are interested in feedback this time. I will either find some way of sharing my screen, or we'll do it with verbal feedback anyway. If that doesn't necessarily work, I will, of course, draw on it like I've been doing in the regular server stuff, and then have a little bit of a spiel as well. We also have a request for a couple of demos of techniques, so if you are interested in either, I think we're doing dead skin, but possibly also some non-metallics as well. It's almost like SquidCon again. And incidentally, on the topic of that, if you are interested in getting more classes and improving your painting, as well as hearing from semi-professionals within the painting job, they're people that we know on the server, but it sounds good that way, as well as a couple of community events that we're running at the same time. SquidCon is returning for its 5th year, maybe? Another year, and it will be happening in January, I believe, unless, of course, YouTube decides to be silly like it was this evening. Much panicking was had as we were trying to set this up. But more info will be posted on the Squidditch Instagram account, and probably the YouTube channel as well, where the VODs for that will go as well. And we have Huskadoku in the chat, so I know at least I have 2 people, well, maybe listening to me. Oh, and Snow saying that she's watching within Discord, so that's all right. But let us begin with actually, I was going to say I should put it to the chat, but I think I'll only get 2 answers as a response. We'll start with a demo, I think, and then we'll do feedback, and then another demo if there is time. There is also, if you are watching this and you are part of the server, or you maybe have stumbled upon this and wondering as to what it is, go watch Squidmar Miniatures. They do good stuff. They paint much better than I do, and they have a server. Go join it, and you can join in the server as well, or enter the Squidmar Open. Either is good. We begin with a Lord of either Plagues or Blights. I can't remember which one it is. And when you approach anything that in the way of skin, especially if you want to approach it in the way of something that is dead, or perhaps something that is dying in the case of the Soul Blight range, or in the case of Nurgle, something that probably wishes it was dead, the best way to start is with a very bright base tone. Now, you can't quite tell this is very bright. I mean, under my lights it does seem easy compared to how pale my hands are, but the original base coat of this was just with a standard black primer. In fact, I think it was the Monument Hobbies matte black one. And then I gave it a spray with the airbrush with green grey. Now, this isn't as bright as perhaps it could have been, and that's entirely because I was lazy and couldn't be bothered to reach for another paint. But since it's Nurgle, a bit of green and a bit of grey never hurt anybody. And we start with a bright undercoat, because then we can either create all of our colours to be brighter over the top, due to the natural opacity of acrylic paints shining through, or we can use the innovative technique of simply glazing over all of your colours, which makes life much easier as we go on. And if we glaze our colours over the top of this already base coat, we already have all of that brightness shining through from there. It's also very forgiving, so if skin isn't necessarily your forte, you can of course try some other techniques as well. Other thing, it's using very thin paint, so you can paint over it if it goes wrong. And yes, I think we'll start with, since I know the request was for a sort of green, slightly bluish flesh, I think we'll start... Hopefully I've opened this one. Have I? Yes, I have. Apologies, I always forget scale 75 paints are sealed before you open them. But we will begin with bearing blue. Any blue is available. You don't have to use them from scale 75. You don't even have to necessarily use them of this brand. But the main thing is that you just have a blue that you know either has decent coverage or matches your general colour palette. Now for my Nurgle stuff, I always like to have a fairly matte finish onto them, because then I can add glossiness later, either by painting it on with natural shines in the same time you would with non-metallic, or you can add gloss varnish on top. Now we'll begin with some blue. Just give it a shake, because anyone that has used them will know that scale 75 paints are notorious for going a bit sludgy when the medium is a bit old. Thankfully this one seems to be okay. Right, and then you're going to want to start with a reasonably sized brush. Normally I would say to go for sort of like one that's slightly larger, just to avoid getting brush strokes, but I think quite frankly you can start with whichever brush you're most comfortable with. And so I'm using a size 1 from Chimera, but other better brushes are available. And we're going to thin our paint down to the consistency of a glaze. If you've never encountered a glaze before, it's simply a fancy term for very thin paint. And the way that I mix all of my glazes, some people say you shouldn't mix them on a wet palette. Normally I would agree, but I can't be bothered to find another palette to do them in. So you get some paint onto your palette, and then you just keep adding water until it flows very, very freely, almost, to quote Bob Ross, about the consistency of ink. And then if you are going to test it all out, you use your thumb, important painting tool for all painters, and then load your brush up. You'll want to probably start with the thumb. If you immediately put the paint on, you'll get a lot of paint deposited on there, but it will be very, very, very thin. Now, what you can then do is get your kitchen roll or paper towel or whatever it is that you're using, and then you want to remove the majority of the paint from it. As you can see, I do this a lot when I'm painting. But that's got rid of the majority of it. And then you can see we have much less paint that is deposited, almost to the point where there is very little paint actually left upon my thumb. And then we can go to our model. This is the same way that you can glaze with anything, but that's simply the process of mixing it. Now I may have actually left all of the paint on my thumb, in which case I'll have to redo that, but you won't when you're painting. And then when we get to the model itself, we'll start with his arm. Nice cylinder to start with. And then we just glaze over the top, drawing our brush to where we want our shadows to be. Now we'll of course be painting over the top of that lighter shade that we put underneath, which won't leave much of a tint, but it will at least start to have a little bit of sort of that blue notes shining through at that stage. Now we'll let that dry, and I'll get a skin tone out. Now any skin tone is good. Generally, if you're going for deader flesh, I would say a brighter one, something like I don't know, Vallejo Dead Flesh, fairly appropriately, or AK Necrotic Flesh. Or you could have a go with Rakarth Flesh, Pallid Witch Flesh, any of those sort of things. Just for this, because he is more nurgly, I'm going to use Citadel Night Quester Flesh. And that's simply because it is on my desk. No other reason than that. There are better paints available, but that's just the one that's there. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing, where we thin our paints down, wipe the majority of the paint off onto something absorbent. Unlike dry brushing, we don't need to use something that is resistant, we want something that is absorbent. You can lick most of the paint off, but again, you don't really want to be tasting paint for the rest of the evening, so you can test it all out. Not a great deal there. Skin tones are a little harder to see, obviously, on your hand, because you have skin, I would assume. And then we'll just add a touch of that skin tone over the area where we've put our blue, just onto the transition. And as you can see, still not leaving a great deal of a mark onto there. And really, this technique does not lend itself to streaming, because it is quite literally watching paint dry very, very slowly. And so what we'll do is we'll apply this layer, and you can see a little bit more just into the shadows. It is starting to have something of an effect. But we'll just wait for that to dry, and we can go into our blue again, same time with a glaze. And we'll apply over the transition, and now we're wet blending glazes as well. And because each time we're applying a glaze, we're tinting everything that is underneath it, the more blue that we put into a skin tone just implies that there is a lack of blood flow underneath it. Same like when people are suffocating, their lips go blue, or if they've had any form of tachycardia, they will also experience that as well. Now, because we have that blue implies no red, so we don't really want to add red tones to it. If you're going for vampires, however, for some form of undead, you may wish to have some redness on there in other areas, simply to balance out the warmer and colder tones. For Nurgle, this is why we can use green. Now, similarly, as you may have heard in classes on painting faces, painting other forms of skin, you need to consider like the zones of colour. So, for instance, where skin is thinner, you'll have more red appearing onto it. Where the light is hitting it, you can get probably more elements of yellow, where other things like that. Now, for undead skin, you can just shift the colour wheel around a few turns in order to get an interesting palette. So, for instance, if you have let's say you would normally have yellow coming from above, where sun would naturally hit light, instead you can go for something like a green, instead pushing it more towards the colder tones with the blue. Therefore, when you would have a redder tone, you can use purple instead. And really the process is just continually building up these glazes over a very, very, very slow, very long evening. Like I said, not the most interesting of things to be demoing, and I probably should have started something before so I had something to show off, but I've been at work. So we shall blame my students for that. Actually, I think they've all gone home as well. But yeah, using a slightly thicker glaze, we can just apply it over some other areas to it. Now, one of the big things about that you may find with at least Citadel paints is, other than things like Bugman's Glow, or what would the other one be? That might have been an old one, actually. Probably just Bugman's Glow these days. But because that one is considered more of a base paint, it has a lot more pigment into it. So it does have a tendency to dry a little chalky here and there. Whereas with things like Night Quester Flesh, which is why I just considered it a better version, what you can do is apply it very liberally over an area, and then it doesn't dry chalky. Instead, it will dry with a fairly nice finish, and you can actually use a slightly thicker glaze instead. And we'll just leave that to dry, as I said, watching paint dry, and I will check the chat just to see if we have any questions left. Nope, don't think so, but that's alright. Do we actually have anyone watching? Good lord, we do. You're all still here. You're braver than I. If you do have any questions about any of the process, or indeed why we're doing this, or anything in general, feel free to ask them, and I can do my best to answer. But as you can see now, even with a couple of glazes that have been built up, we can see we still have that light coming through on some of the more glutinous areas of our Nurgle chappy here. And because we're using a glaze, we've not covered up all of that detail, we can still see the shadows in all of the recesses. Now this we like, because once again we can dip into our blue, get most of the paint off, test it on our thumb, never hurts to, and then we can glaze that blue over the top as well. So any areas that are now slightly thinner, that would naturally have that more either blood flow flowing through them, or in just the areas where the model has rounded curves, we can have that blue onto it that then will tint the pink, but it'll have a nice smooth transition between them. And now you can see he's starting to look a bit more ill. just onto those areas. And it's very, very subtle, but because we are using glazes and we're building this up over a slow amount of time, that's ungrammatical, a long amount of time slowly, that works, you can start to really get the colours to become opaque, but very, very carefully. Now, if you do have issues with things like brush control, or you're worried about blending, or anything like this, I would highly encourage you to give a go at, have a go, rather. Oh, I'm very bad this evening. Be to have a go at using glazes for when you're painting your things. Simply because it means that you have a lot more time to work on things. You don't get sort of lose any of that definition of your miniature. And it just means that you don't have to rush with anything. Let's face it, you are painting, it is a hobby, you don't have to rush with anything. Yeah, there is a deadline, but that's miles away. So even if you were to have it all go wrong, you've got enough time for it to go wrong at least 3 more times before the deadline. But I'm sure it won't. Anyway, let's put another layer onto this. And I think we'll do it just onto his... Yeah, we'll do it on the stomach, why not? And even on the areas where we've put the skin already, we can do another glaze over the top. And you can start to see it's actually building up a lot quicker than it did the first time. This is fine. And for any large model with a lot of skin onto it, you may be thinking, well, if it's a very big model that you need both hands in order to hold, you're not exactly going to want to glaze it with just a teeny tiny brush and very, very thin paint. Now, you absolutely can, and I know Golden Demon winners that have indeed done this, but in many cases life's too short. So if you are going to approach it that way, I would say to instead invest in a decent dry brush. Which I bet for many people who know would never think that I would say that, but we'll just leave that dry for a moment. One of the bigger ones from things like Artis Opus, where they have the large sort of dry brush one. Mine's a bit... yeah, mine is quite messy, but ones like this, or the rather larger ones, you can use them for stippling, which is what most of the channel, the Artis Opus channel, has been dedicated to these days. And by stippling an area first, again with thin paint, taking most of it off on the dry palette, when you then come to glaze, you'll have a much easier time getting the paint to stick, because as you've got a textured surface, the paint is just a lot more grippy. Similar to with if you put matte varnish over the top of things, it likes to cling to all of those paint particles. So rather than having to build up thousands upon thousands of layers with glazing, which I'm not going to subject you to this evening, but you get the idea, you can instead do it in only sort of like 1 or 2. Or 1 or 200 if you're me, but that's probably just me. And I think really that's the general gist of the technique. Start with a very light undercoat, glaze your colours over the top, and then once you've got the colours with a decent amount of definition and opacity that you wish to use, then you can start highlighting. Now, I don't necessarily know what you would want to highlight them with. Personally, I would say, well, we could do a little bit of highlighting. We've only been going for about 20 minutes, so probably should give you your money's worth. So we'll glaze this over the top. There we go. Give that a second to dry, check the chat again. And then we can see, now we do have some other textures onto here, so since I know that it was requested in the chat, at least at some point, let's do a little bit of non-metallics. So we will start with Dark Flesh from Monument Hobbies, the world's greatest paint brand. It is very quiet out there, but I suppose it is a Friday before Christmas. Everybody's probably got better things to do than listen to me ramble on about paint. Which indeed begs the question as to why you're here, Husk. So I would imagine you've got much better things to do. Now, funnily enough, this is kind of my preparation for Darkwater as well. My copy is arriving on Sunday, and I'm very much looking forward to it, and I'm going to see if I can paint at least 4 of the heroes and the enemies by the 28th of this month, for when I have my first game of it. Now, we're applying the dark flesh, which actually, we can use this with our glazing again. Let's put a little bit of dark flesh just in the recesses. Again, using a glaze, very, very, very forgiving, as we said. But even just by adding that little bit of extra colour in just with a glaze, we immediately have a bit more pop within the shadows. I mean, you are also ill, Husk. Personally, I'd be asleep, but that's just me. But for our non-metallics, just to really hammer home the point, I am glazing it into the base coat as well. Because if there's one thing that you should take away from this stream, it's that glazing is your friend. A very, very slow friend that will annoy you probably by the end of it. And whilst that dries, we'll add a touch more skin tone. Yeah, why not? Well, funny enough, it was your illness that gave me the idea to use an Urgle model in the first place, Husk, so... Oh dear, no, I've got it. But yeah, just do overall glaze. Now, as you can see, all of the skin tone, it's very, very, very low opacity at this stage, which, again, means still quite translucent. We can see all of the details through it. Now, that is good for the idea of making it seem translucent, and you could, if you wanted to, then do subcutaneous sort of like stuff inside it. You can maybe do some wriggly bits. I mean, he has maggots coming out of his stomach. But if you want to deliberately make it look very pale, the same way you can do translucent cloth, for instance, again, glazing is very, very useful. But just in terms of the general application, glazing is always a useful tool to have within your arsenal, because you can just use it to apply all of your base coats if you want to. Again, it'll take you a while, but you will have a very, very, very smooth outcome as a result. But if you are sick of it, you can, of course, still layer up as you normally would. And you know what? Let's do the big spike as well. And actually I can tie this very nicely to some feedback as well. Now this goes pretty much for all competition entries, and while we're waiting for things to dry, the original point of the server version of this competition is for people that may never have entered a competition before. So we'll just leave that dry for a moment. Now, if you've never entered a competition before, but you want to give it a go, the main thing is to always remember that It's your paint job on the mini that is going to be judged, not the miniature itself. Now, some miniatures are going to be more interesting than others. If you were to do a very, very old Metal Warhammer one that is like one of the old Beasts of Chaos ones that were just a bit dodgy even when they were first released, you may not necessarily have an enjoyable time when you're painting it. But if you were to go for, I don't know, a Nurgle guy versus an elf versus anything else, it really doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but the category that you enter it in can. Single miniature is always a much more competitive category than things like diorama. And for that, you may wish to think, well, if you're entering into this competition and it's your first time entering, are you going to enter something that is a teeny tiny small mini, like one of the Lord of the Rings ones, or one of the Cities of Sigmar ones, or even a Lumineth mini, just because they're a bit more spindly? Or do you want to enter something that is a bit bigger? Similarly, you can question as to whether or not you're going to be able to take photos of it easily. All of these are things that, obviously, when you get to the point that you're going to have to deal with them, it may be the cause of some panicking. Indeed, there is something of a habit of that of mine. I've entered a few competitions now, won a couple, and the main thing that I've learnt from all of them is that you'll probably get yourself into quite a state the night before you enter, because you'll then start to question every single brushstroke that you have ever made upon the miniature, and think, well, maybe I shouldn't enter. But I can say with some confidence that always you should. There is never a case of not entering a miniature into something, because ultimately it never hurts to have a go. You're not losing anything, unless of course you're travelling to an area and you've booked hotels or anything like that. But at the moment, that's few and far between. Plus, the Squidmar Open is an online one, which makes life much easier. So always try to enter something, even if it's something that you're perhaps now doubting, because chances are everybody else is doing that. Unless you're someone like Arno Lazaro, of course, who's pretty sure he goes into competitions knowing he's going to get best in show. Not jealous at all. But then the second thing to consider is, have you spent as much time on your paint job as you possibly can? Now, this doesn't mean to necessarily say that you're avoiding sleep or you're staying up all night painting stuff because you need to make sure the eyes are perfect. I mean, I do that anyway, but I don't recommend it. Instead, what I would say is to make sure that when you approach your miniatures, you are always taking the time that the miniature deserves. If you're painting something that has maybe taken you 2 or 3 days and you see people are still working on them, maybe think, well, can I push areas even further? Generally, the answer is yes. If you have, say, done a technique and you think, well, I like the way that it's come out, but I feel that it could be a little bit better, try again. While you've still got time to paint into a competition, there is nothing wrong with sitting there and just thinking, right, what could be something that the judges might comment on, or might be something that I think I could really show off in that? Because that's what competitions are, it's just competitive showing off. So if you look at your miniature and you think, well, that sort of looks right, or you can do the horrendous thing. Normally I wouldn't recommend this, but for competition painting, you can do it every so often, is get your phone and take a photo of your miniature. Then zoom in all the way, and then cringe at all of the areas that you have missed and where the paint has gone into places that it probably shouldn't have done. This is good. It feels horrible at the time, but it is good, I promise. From there, you'll be able to see all of the little things that you then need to correct. I had this myself at last year's Squidmar Open, where I was painting a bust from Black Crow Miniatures. I'd painted it quite quickly, and I thought, yeah, it was just... But I was used to painting a bust, having gone in with the ego of thinking, yes, this is all going to go well, I can do all of this, it's going to be fine. I'd even painted it on stream. Finished it all off, and tried to take photos, and realised that while I'd been painting it, looking at it like this, with the light hitting it basically from this angle. As soon as I did that, and had the light hitting it from a sort of more diagonal angle and one at the front, all of the areas that I'd missed suddenly became very, very stark. And of course I then had to spend another 3 weeks painting it in order to make sure that they were all covered. Now, learn from my mistakes, to quote Matthew Mercer, and don't do that. Instead, spend the time to work on things. Enjoy your hobby. Yes, it's for a competition, but it is just a hobby at the end of the day. dear me. I think husk has infected me. But now we have a... it's nearly a strong enough base coat. Oh, this is another thing that always comes up with all of these things. For some reason, there is a trend online of whenever you're base coating a miniature is to either try and get it to cover in one coat. And I think this has stemmed from things like contrast paints or speed paints or even like the slap chop things. To be honest, just ignore that. They're not good. Instead, look at whether or not the paint has full coverage, and that simply means, can you still see the undercoat coming through? Now, as most of you will probably be starting with a zenithal base coat, what you need to do is see, well, can you still see the grain of the spray paint underneath? If you're starting with a full sort of like white undercoat from there, can you still see every sort of detail, but there's no sort of splotchy bits? And so now, by just adding another layer over the top, you can see most of the areas that were a little bit splotchy are a bit more covered. I'll probably still need to do another layer, but it's always best to, when you're base coating, start with a strong layer of paint. Now, that doesn't mean to necessarily say load your brush up with completely thick paint and then gob it onto the miniature. That is wrong. You will lose detail by doing that. Instead, build it up until you have with thin layers, or glazes if you have an hour, and just make sure that it is all covered. You'll have a much easier time as a result. Oh, we have things in chat. Thick glazing isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just you'll generally find that you'll have an easier time, or at least a slightly easier time, with much, much thinner ones. And generally to the point of where you don't actually see any paint onto the model when you're applying it half the time. Sounds counterintuitive, but it does tend to make life a little bit easier, because then it's such a small deposit of paint that you're adding to the piece that it doesn't affect the overall tone or the overall finish. And then you can keep all of the lovely detail that we have. Obviously, you probably won't be painting a corpulent reanimated corpse type thingy, but you never know, you might. I was going to make an American politician joke just then, but I remembered we're on the internet. But the thing that you can then sort of see, just as a demonstration for why building a skin up in glazes is at least a little bit better, is if we approach it with thicker paint. So I'll load my brush up for something that I would normally use for a layer. There we go. If we use the back, and let's take this arm. If I paint that on, you'll notice immediately we have brush strokes. We have hard lines, we have tons of things that we don't want. Skin often doesn't have direct and straight lines onto it, but bristles do. So instead, using glazes just means that you can lose all of that texture that you would build up otherwise, and instead just paint it on. And there we go. And just like that, we can erase all of those brushstrokes. You will have to do several more layers, but again, it's part of the fun. Just enjoy it. And just because this is my model, I was going to enter this into the Squidmar Open. I just forgot. So tide marks are only when you have too much water onto your area and you're applying it. So all a tide mark is for when the paint dries. It's pigment that is drying around in a circle the area for where the droplet is. Now, that is why when we load our brush up, so if we get a lot of paint... Oh, no, that's drying a bit quickly. Probably shouldn't have put the heating on before I started streaming, but hey. So if we get a lot of paint, like we have for this, and I dab it onto my thumb, as that dries, that pool will leave tide marks, and you can see in the light the meniscus forming all the way around there. Now, as that dries, that's where the pigment is going to collect, because it will be lighter than the water, and you can see now all the blue is dipping all the way down there. Now, when we are glazing, if we remove most of the paint from the brush, it also pulls most of the water out. Now, water, in this case, is more absorbent to whatever we're using, paper towel, anything like that. And so just the pigment is left in the brush. It's got a little bit of the water to suspend it, but we're using mostly pigment at this stage. And then when we return to our model, we can apply the paint over the top, and then we're just dragging the pigment with very, very, very light suspension. So the water will dry that is going around it, and then the pigment stays where we want to put it. Now, in some cases, just for some paints, if they have, for instance, the rarer pigments into them, so what would be a good one? Toluidine yellow, or is it Toluidine yellow? Toluidine something. So things by Chimera, or which is another bad one. I've probably got it on my desk somewhere. This one, actually, because I was using it the other day. Prussian blue from AK. Looks nice, great to spray through the airbrush, real bugger when it comes to glazing. Now, because it's got a certain blue pigment in, it does not want to sit where you want it to be. And so that you do get a couple of tide marks that are left onto it. However, it's very easy to correct them. You can either, when it is still drying, rinse your brush off so that nearly all of the water and all the paint is gone from it. Get it a little bit wet. Now, this one you can put your brush in your mouth. It does help with that if you're a follower of the brush licking method, as popularised by Emil and Lucas online. Or just sort of, you can dip it onto the sponge in your palette if you like. It's just something to get a little bit of water on. And then around the edge of where you'd have your tide marks, just run the brush around there. Like if we use this skin lesion as an example, what you're going to do then is just drag the brush away from it. And then because you're adding more water to it, you can pull all of that tide mark away. Or if you don't just sort of want to do it and you want to have it so you don't build up too much paint or anything like that, just with your lighter tone, then glaze just over the top of those. And then it'll have the exact same effect, but it'll cover up the darker pigment. Might take a few instances of doing it, but it'll still give you a nice smooth finish. Hopefully that answers your question, Anne. And it's a good job you're here. I'm going to go into feedback soon. But we'll do some gold first. Right, so let's have another layer, and then for our next tone, let's use, orange brown from Monument Hobbies as part of the Flameon set. So when you think of non-metallics, you probably think of Flameon because you'll have seen his stuff online, so let's use his paints. And for our first layer, we're going to take 1 part dark flesh and 1 part orange brown until you get a sort of mid-brown sort of thing, which is a very poor way of describing it, but still. And then we'll do it with layers. I won't subject you to more glazes, we'll be here all night. And we'll use the bell, why not? So I think we'd have light hitting about there. And then about there, coming from the other direction. Make sure to get the edges. Little bit of highlight just onto there. And finish up there. Scale artists are very good, they are very tempting. The downside of scale artists, though, for some of them, with their newer pigments that they're using, people have described that they are sort of either separating or they just get a little bit watery when they're on the palette. Or not watery enough in some cases. The way that I've found to overcome that is to put a little bit of either Flow Improver or Airbrush Thinner onto your palette with them. Flow Improver works a little bit better, but Airbrush Thinner is more easily available. Now, yes, that's what I was talking about beforehand, before we started talking about nice smelling paints. So for when I'm layering, or when I'm just doing any form of painting, really, as you've just noticed, I normally drag my brush from multiple directions. Now, I'll demonstrate here. If we start with, let's do an edge highlight around there, and then I want my highlight to be in this little sort of crook there, into that little area. So what we're going to do is we'll apply our edge highlight onto there, avoiding that area where I've still got wet paint, and then I'll find where the middle of that highlight is, so I want it to be about there, and then I will drag my brush from about halfway of the area that I want the light to be, and I'll drag it towards the middle. If we then do it from the other direction, then we get more paint deposited in the middle where we want our light to actually be. From there, we then have thinner paint leading into there, and lo and behold, we are then pretty much glazing and layering at the same time, but with thicker paint, so it doesn't take an age. Now you'll probably still have to do another layer of it, but it does mean that you can then have a much easier time glazing. And we can do it over here as well. Now, I tend to use the tip of the brush when I'm doing this. You can use the side if you've got a little bit more control. Personally, I prefer to using the tip just because it means that you get a slightly scratchier finish on your metal, and it can look sort of either brushed or a bit beaten up, so you get some nice texture building up without necessarily trying. And then if it looks good by the time you've highlighted everything, you don't have to glaze. We'll just do another layer of this, and then we can move on. If we have any further questions in chat, feel free to ask them. I can do my best to answer them in a roundabout manner. And for our next layer, we are going to then jump all the way up to pure orange brown. It's a bit of a leap, but we're now applying our sort of like our mid-tones, I suppose, which will start to make it look a bit more gold. And keep our edge highlight. And then we'll layer up the lower side. And why not, we'll put a little notch there as well. Now, rather deliberately, what I have done, if we zoom in onto this, is when I've been layering up this mid-tone, I have left some tide marks over the area, just to show so this area, the technique that I've shown before, but also in the lower case, I've left some of the layer tone either side of this highlight, but then I've also, on the top one, just completely painted over it. Now, it's always good to leave a little bit of the previous colour that you were using around your layers, just so you get that nice gradiated build-up. But if in the case that you do paint over it and think, oh god, I've lost all of this, I'm going to have to repaint it, worry not. Because you can either just paint either side of it, which seems quite obvious, or we can go back to our old friend glazing, and oops, use a bit too much water onto there, but that's alright. And just again, reapply those tones in between. Now that's going to take a little while to dry now, so I may have scuppered that a little. But as I think the person who wanted NMM isn't watching anyway, that's fine, I can do a different class on it later. But what time are we on? Oh, 6 minutes past 9. So, For skin, the next step from after you've got your base tones in is simply to highlight with your preferred highlight tone, mixing it into either the blue or the skin tone that you have used before, or to go a little bit higher than that, you can just keep highlighting it as normal, but I would still recommend to use glazing. Now, you don't have to glaze to bring it all up into finished areas. You could if you wanted to. Let's do this. Is instead build up a glaze in thin lines like we normally would on non-metallics, or you can build it up just in any way possible. You can even stipple if you would like to, but do be aware that that does put a little bit of pressure onto the tip of your brush, because if you imagine you're doing this constantly, it probably would. So just be aware that you probably will have to condition your brushes after using it. For non-metallics, it's just a case of going brighter and brighter until you reach the end. For more details on that, there's definitely feedback on the server, because I put some up yesterday. But that's probably something to more go into that people can DM me if they would like NMM help. Or I'll do another class purely on that, or look at the Squidish website, YouTube channel, because there is a class from last year's SquidCon on non-metallics. But yes, any questions from people in the chat while I set up feedback? Or from Discord if people are watching. If not, we shall go into feedback. And then I need window capture. Bear with me, should have probably set this up before. I set this. Yep, that looks good. Right. So hopefully somebody can tell me, otherwise I won't be able to see, that you should be able to see what's her name? Skeetend, I think, from Cult of Paint. As painted by Ant, who is in the chat. It is the base coat for the gold was Dark Flesh from Monument Hobbies, which I realise I'm holding up, but you can't see because I've put the thingy in the front. Let's swap those around. Is this from Monument Hobbies. Now for the full recipe, in case you want to have a go yourself, is you need Dark Flesh. Whoops, need bigger hands. There we go. You need Dark Flesh as a base coat. Then mix in 1 part dark flesh to 1 part orange brown to get your sort of darker shadow mid-tone. Then for your mid-tones themselves, and then where you start painting in your reflections, is orange brown itself. Then for your highlights of your reflections, you then do 1 part orange brown, 1 part golden brown. And then you can keep adding in more golden brown until it's sort of at a brighter tone, and then you can just add some ivory over the top in order to brighten it up, or add ivory into the mix if you want to have a bit more of a sort of subtle transition. But if you want to have that very sharp, sudden twist into light, you can do it that way instead. Anyway, feedback. That's what you're all here for. Well, some of you are here for. So we can start with Ant's Skeetend. Now, as there was nothing specific for feedback, we can just go for general overall things. So we can see that you've got your base coats put in, a little bit of shading into there. And, pause that. If the paints are chalky, Oku, give them either more of a shake, or you might need to, on your palette, is swap the foam out, or whatever the substrate you're using is to put the palette paper on top. I've noticed quite a lot of the Monument Hobbies, if there's anything stopping the water from forming an aqueous connection between the paper and the foam, whatever it is you're putting underneath, could be mould or just old water or anything like that, they can go a little bit chalky. Other thing to also watch with them is they come pre-thinned, so you don't have to thin them as much straight out of the bottle. We can go over it if necessary. But yes, anyway, feedback. So we can see that you've got all of the nice blues in, which is very nice. We get that lovely cold tones towards the top, and indeed having the more greener blues towards the bottom does help in order to show that you are going for a more sort of wintry theme, which is very, very nice. The slightly warmer skin tones does work. The one thing I would just be a little careful of is that if we zoom out, as it stands currently, my eye is drawn immediately to this part of her hand, which you can't see in my cursor. There we go, this part of her hand. Now, that could be because it is directly into the middle of the photo, but it would just be a little thing to just be careful for when you're highlighting things, of being able to pull all of your lights so that you have either the most vibrant or most eye-catching colours into the important places. So, for instance, if you were to do the top of the hood, the eye of the eagle, the sort of like areas on the bow if you wanted to, because weapons are always fun to look at, or if you're doing some design onto the cloth as well, just to make sure that those draw the eye, but they don't draw it to only one point of the mini like we have there, but just so that you can have some more areas to pull the viewer's eye around the entire piece. You do similar things onto the base, but do be aware that that will then drag the viewer's... I'm so used to giving feedback for work, I keep wanting to say readers, so apologies if I stumble over that, but you will then want to get the viewer's eye will then look directly at the base, which then avoids the model entirely. Now, a trick for doing all of that is, there's an old thing that, I can't remember who said it, it may have been Roman Lepat in one of it, but it might have been Banshee as well, one of them, they're both good painters, was that generally you should try to keep whatever colour is on the bottom of your miniature, or at the very bottom, make sure that that repeats at the very top. Now, I think we can take that with a grain of salt, because that doesn't always work. If you've got lava at the bottom of your base, for instance, you don't want bright red at the top, or maybe you do. And in yellow it'd certainly give you some contrast. I think it'll be interesting to see how you do it, because yellow is a bit of a pain to paint. But personally what I would do is just make sure that, because you've got the colder tones of the blues, is start to add some of them into the skin as well. So have some, like you could have little touches of a grey around her wrist for sort of some areas where there's lower blood flow areas, from where the skin is slightly hardened. Add in even some, you could do some touches of sunny skin tone, or like ice yellow over the top, just because that's got some natural blue into it as well, to make it obviously a darker, colder tone. But yeah, I think overall it's a very good start, and I'm very interested to see where it goes. Also, props to you, you've painted more of yours than I have of mine. Mine is still in the box. And, oh, that's Shash's next one. We'll go to the back of this one. Again, similar things for the back, but again, something just a suggestion, but bear in mind, these are only suggestions, you do not have to follow them at all, would be to try and accentuate how dark some of the shadows are, at least going towards the back. Because if you can show that there is a natural light difference between it, one means that you can show that the light is hitting her from the front, and it'll make it look a lot cooler, but also then you can add some warmer tones or something into the shadows at the back, especially towards the bottom where you've got the brown of the tree, just to contrast the eagle being at the top, which is predominantly a warmer, sort of redder brown already. So again, just a suggestion, but if you've got your own colour palette, that's absolutely fine. Ice blue, blue, white. I'd say go for ice yellow, just because you get that nice yellow tones for it, but you do still have that blue into it. I think blue-white might be a bit too sort of desaturated, and so you'll end up with a little bit of a, not necessarily a colder, but you'll just end up with a more washed-out sort of look into it. So personally I'd go for ice yellow, but you can try both, see which you prefer. And then we can go to Shas. Now, this we've only got 2 for feedback, so this won't be a particularly long segment. Now, as we can see, there is definitely some stuff that's going on. I like the red spots. They do draw the eye a lot. And having the red transition there, definitely think that is a good addition to it. Other things where I can see that we were talking the other night about sort of just keeping the purple shadows but sort of accentuating them a little and having them blend more with the skin. So definitely think that that's coming along. I'd say for the next steps, it will be the more blending side of it, because a lot of the highlights that you've got so far, all of the sort of muscle groups, they're all individually highlighted, whereas he is one big dragon if we zoom out. And so what you could then start to look at is taking your intermediate tones, not necessarily your highlights or your deepest shadows, and then rather appropriately given what we were talking about earlier, glazing over them to lessen the depth of these shadows, but they'll still look darker, but you've then got some elements where the natural transitions are there, and it'll look like one skin that is stretched across musculature and bone, rather than it being sort of essentially different bits stuck to it. I know ML on the channel refers to these as muscle islands. And it's kind of a similar thing, only on a dragon, which is more fun than painting people. Indeed, elves are more fun than painting people as well, for a similar thing. And the other thing that we were talking about is colours for the eye. Now, I can't tell whether he has 2 eyes, or that's just 4 eyes technically, or that's some sort of like addition onto his nose or something, but I'll assume that he has 2 eyes on either side. So having them as something brighter, we were talking about maybe a blue or a yellow-green. I would think the yellow-green is perhaps your better option, but I would try and get something like, what would it be, AK Pistachio or Laser Green or something like that. They're very, very bright and they're very saturated, and so what you can do is take a pure white. Personally, I use, swap back to desk view. Where's it gone? It's disappeared. No, probably should have found it before I switched back over. Sod it, we use this one. So that's black, we won't want that. For a bright white, I would suggest using something like a titanium white. This is the Aerocolour ink. You can use them as paints, they're just a little bit thinner. Or something like a thicker, heavy body white. Tip for everybody, by the way, heavy body whites just are better than standard mini colour whites. You can even get them into the ink form, but obviously wouldn't necessarily get these if there is a white available. Where has my Schminker titanium white gone? That's annoying, I shall have to find that. But yes, having a heavy body white will just cover better, and so for when you get to doing sort of bright highlights or, say for instance, glows or any element like that, having a bright heavy body white and adding a touch of your other colour that you want for a glow, for instance, in this case a blue or a yellow green or anything like that, you will then get a super, super, super bright hit of that white pigment. But because white does cling on to all of the other colours just from static, you'll find that it will blend a lot easier with the colour that you've got around it. Plus you're having that white tone in it, so it will look brighter to the eye. So, useful thing for that as well. The other thing that I was thinking about, and again, purely a suggestion, do not have to follow it if you do not want to, you've got the spots going along the back, which again look really nice. They add lots of visual pop. But if you're going to do for the wings, there's already the purple membranes, but I would say try and push yourself a little bit further and do a little bit of freehand on some of them. Now, because you've got the diorama base going, and there's all of this going on, which you're going to have to eventually paint, which we'll probably see in future streams if we do them. Looking back at the top, try painting, because assuming you're going to use a black background, is paint in some holes within his wings. Make him look a bit weather-beaten, because then this very large area of skin that you've got that does take up quite, well, most of the model, if we're being honest. It is lovely, but the wings are huge. Adding in those little bits of visual interest, and again this goes for really any model, if you have larger, flatter areas that you're not quite sure what you're going to do with them, try adding in little bits of either freehand or additions or colour changes or just something that's a little bit different, simply because then it will draw the eye towards it, and like we were saying with Ant's elf, it moves the eye around the piece, and therefore you're not just focused with looking at, so for instance, if the eye is glowing, that will immediately draw the eye appropriately to it. But then you've only got this bit that the viewer is looking at. All of the rest of it, that just goes a bit missing, and it fades into the background. Whereas if you start with the eye, and maybe you have some, the glow hits this underside of the pinion just there, as soon as that's being hit by the glow, suddenly the eye is drawn from there up to there, and you think, ooh, what's this? It's a wing. And then you can see over here, maybe there's some freehand bits into there, and you think, yes, that's very interesting, or maybe they link into, we think, ooh, spots, that's going across his back, and then immediately then we are looking at the entire piece as opposed to little bits of it. And compositionally, this is something that you must always sort of think about into your sight lines, as I know that they're called. In real composition theory, personally, I just like to think about it as little bits of the model, as I just explained. But if you are doing bigger entries, this is something to consider, but all entries, especially for the Squidmar Open, because it's one of the things that is mentioned within the rule set for it, is to think about your narrative. Now, for those that do not know, professionally, I am a professor of creative writing at a university, so narratives, kind of things that I like. So if you are creating one, the easiest thing to sort of think about for any narrative is one person wants something, the other person doesn't want them to get it. Oldest thing known to man, why wars have started. Putting that into a diorama can also be done, but most good dioramas, especially compositionally, have 3 stories going on at once. You'll have your main story. In this case, it would be dragon has flown down, either knocked over a ruin or is surveying something there. You then have a secondary story. This could be something that is going on in the foreground. This is either something that is about to happen or something that has just happened. So if we use The Hobbit, for instance, as an example, if we were to imagine that this is Smaug, you could have Bilbo Baggins lurking just there. Maybe an indication of the Arkenstone in there. That's a second story. We know the dragon is defending its treasure, and we know that somebody is coming in to steal it. But then the all-important third story. This is something to, especially when you're getting a judging panel involved, this is something that you will reward the judges for finding, which is a nice way of doing it. It gives back to your judges, and that's not because I am the judge of the server one, along with Husk in the chat. Definitely not focusing this on us at all, but it does help. And having your third story in just means that you bring that idea of moving around the diorama, looking at the composition from all angles, because then you'll be able to find this extra little story that's hidden away inside it. Now, in some cases, this could be I know there was a Sam Lenz diorama that he did, where if you follow all of the rabbits around, you find, I think it's a garden gnome in one of his pieces. If we use chassis, for instance, there could be big dragon into there, person hiding into here, and then maybe just around the back there's a goblin also stealing stuff. It's a third little story that doesn't add anything necessarily to the other 2, but it just gives that little bit of visual interest. And if you can get all 3 stories into one piece, onto a base that isn't too big but also not too small, then you're pretty much up there with all dioramas as you would need. And from there, you're pretty much a shoo-in for all of that, and then you just have to paint it, which is the tricky part. But hopefully that has been useful for you all. Hopefully, I know we've only got a couple of people into the chat, but hopefully it's been useful. If you have any further questions, feel free to either ping me on Discord, post them up anywhere you need to, or DM me as necessary. I can't remember when we're going to do another of these because Christmas is coming up, and as we know, that is a time for using troughs and conveyor belts as dining utensils and getting blitz out of your mind on brandy butter, and therefore we do not know what is coming into the future, but we will see. But probably one will be coming after Christmas. Hopefully I'll have a co-host for that as well, if he is better, looking at you, Husk, and we shall go from there. But yes, thank you all so much for watching, and this will be up on the Squiddage YouTube channel eventually. I've just got to then get it off my channel and send it to Snow to upload onto there. But there will be a link in the chat for people to also refer back to this or watch back at their leisure if you want to hear me ramble into your ears for about an hour. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next one, all around the